good evening, good evening. To everybody at home, thank you so much, and to everybody here, thank you so much. Welcome. It was a bit of a challenge. You in the theater get a special thank you because you had to walk and bike a bit further. We're running a bit late tonight for you at home because there's a transit strike in Munich. So traffic's a mess, and there's no public transportation. So everyone who's here gets a gold star. Yeah. So for those of us here in this gorgeous theater in Amerikahaus, my name is Bartley Grosser-Richter, and I'm the founder of Munich Dialogues on Democracy. As most of you know, these dialogues are a cooperation between the Yale Club of Germany and Munich's Amerikahaus. So I'd like to welcome you in the name of Amerikahaus and of the Yale Club of Germany. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Amerikahaus for their hospitality. This week, we sent out an email that I hope you all received with the subject, the title of the powerful essay written for the one-year anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine by our guest tonight, Joshua Yaffa. An anniversary of destruction, loss, and bravery in Ukraine. The essay for The New Yorker captures the resilience of the Ukrainian people, as well as the sheer brutality of the Russian war crimes. The exhaustion, as one person talking to Josh said, that death is just one or two handshakes away, and the incredible sense of purpose that the Ukrainian population has found. It's hard for us here to really know what's going on inside Russia and inside Ukraine right now. So we really are especially fortunate to have with us this evening an expert on Putin's Russia, who's the Moscow correspondent for The New Yorker. Joshua Yaffa has been covering Russia for over a decade, and in his book, Between Two Fires, Truth, Ambition, and Compromise in Putin's Russia, he addresses the impact of living under Putin on the psyche of the nation and the moral struggles that many in Russia confront. Josh gives us a nuanced picture of a people who are prone to compromise and accommodation with the state, people who have struggled to balance the strict and often arbitrary demands of an authoritarian system with their own personal desires and conscience. And for this book, he won the Orwell Prize in 2021. Josh's interest in Russia goes back more than 2 decades when he started learning Russian in college and first visited it as a student in the summer of 2001. After getting a master's degree in journalism and international affairs, he worked as an associate editor at Foreign Affairs. He moved to Moscow 11 years ago now, reporting for The Economist, amongst many others, before joining The New Yorker in 2015. For his work in Russia, he has been named a fellow at New America, a recipient of the American Academy's Berlin Prize, and a finalist for the Livingston Award. The book came out before the current war started. So Josh has spent the past year traveling across Ukraine, witnessing the war up close and reporting what he sees. We are able to hear from him what the war looks like for the people of Ukraine, as well as what everyday Russians understand about the war and their own responsibility. After Josh speaks, we will have time to take your questions. We'll be using Slido, and that's got a phone login. If you're in the theater, you can, it'll come up here. There's a QR code you can scan. It works from all the way in the back. Or you can go to slido.com at home and put in #AmericaHouse and send us your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. So please join me in welcoming to Munich, Joshua Yaffa.
Thanks, Bartley, for the kind introduction, and to Amerikahaus and Yale Club for having me, and to everyone for making it tonight. I'm glad to be able to share, as Bartley said, some of my experience reporting these last months in Ukraine and from Russia the decade before that. A programming note, I'll be showing some photos as I talk taken by friends and colleagues who I worked with in Ukraine this past year, namely Emmanuel Satoli, Emil Duque, and Sasha Maslov. On the morning of February 24th, I woke up to the sound of explosions in Kramatorsk, a city in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Russian cruise missiles struck a military airfield and munitions depot on the outskirts of town. The windows shook and the earth rattled, a sign it was time to run to the basement. On early morning television in Russia, Vladimir Putin was declaring the start of what he called a special military operation. After the war began, I left Kramatorsk and drove for 2 days to Kiev, which was then the main target of the Russian invasion. Russian troops tried to penetrate the capital with lightly armed mobile units, operating under the assumption that they could take the city in a matter of days. This was the special operation of Putin's dark imagination, that Ukraine, a country supposedly without a history or claim to independent nationhood, would quickly succumb and collapse, and that its president, Vladimir Zelensky, would flee and its society would acquiesce to Moscow-imposed rule. A crude military logic underpinned Putin's decision to invade. He and the paranoid security officials around him, most of whom were in their 60s or 70s, believed that Ukraine had become the instrument of an ever-expanding West. Even if Ukraine hadn't or didn't formally join NATO, it was receiving weapons and military training from NATO countries. With time, perhaps this support could amount to a kind of backdoor NATO membership. Ukraine was drifting away out of Russia's sphere of influence and becoming a de facto ally of Russia's enemies. Better to strike while Russia retained the military advantage and use that force to refashion Ukraine's politics to accord with his own vision of Russia's security interests. But there was also an element of historical messianism in Putin's thinking, a pseudo-philosophical strain that ran far deeper than concerns over Western arms. The summer before the invasion, he published a 6,000-word treatise in which he proclaimed Russians and Ukrainians to be, quote, one people, but with a clear hierarchy. Ukraine's rightful place was under the protection and imperial care of Russia, not led astray politically, militarily, culturally by the West. Quote, I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is only possible in partnership with Russia. He wrote, only by acting now to rejoin the two peoples as they were meant to be could Putin prevent Ukraine from becoming irreparably European or even, from that matter, Ukrainian. Because once that happened, it would indeed be too late. Russia would be occupying a foreign land. Putin was in a way right in his diagnosis. Russia was losing Ukraine, or in fact already had. I had been reporting from Ukraine for a decade, and it was clear that with every passing year, people in Ukraine felt less attachment to Russia or the shared Soviet past, but rather saw themselves as citizens of a modern, vibrant, chaotic, but thoroughly sovereign and independent state. If anything, Putin was more correct than he knew. Not only was this drift real, but it had gone further than he imagined. By the time he launched his invasion, Ukraine was not all that interested in Russia as a model, let alone elder partner. But where Putin was unmistakably and catastrophically wrong was in his diagnosis, rather the treatment to that diagnosis. The war would be the final death knell in Ukraine's separation from Russia and provide a new founding myth for the creation of a society that, out of trauma and shock, would find unprecedented unity and consolidation. Right up into the invasion itself, few Ukrainians believed that it could happen, at least not on the scale that it did. But once it had, the response was immediate. In Kiev, it was hard to find a person not involved in the war effort, whether by signing up to fight, the military recruitment offices were turning away volunteers, or gathering and delivering food, medicine, and other supplies. This wide-scale, instinctual in many cases, burst of solidarity and patriotism in partly was explained by the war's existential quality for Ukrainians. To surrender would be to be killed. Massacres in places like Bucha and the horror stories that emerged from occupied cities in Kherson and Kharkiv region made that clear. Russia was unambiguous in its intent to negate Ukrainian history and culture. But Ukrainian resolve also has to do with levels of trust, political engagement, and civic responsibility that existed long before the war. Put short, Ukrainians had a culture of taking charge of their country's politics and their own communities, tendencies that were brought into sharper relief by the war, but existed long before it. In Ukraine, belief in victory and support for continuing the fight, that is, refusing to concede anything to Russia in negotiations, has been consistently high since the start of the invasion, as much as 80 or even 90% in many polls. Clearly, Ukrainians want to win the war, not end it prematurely by negotiating with Putin. As they argue, why should they negotiate about the seizure of their territory by force? As for how the war is seen in Russia itself, the political philosopher Greg Yudin splits the country into three groups: dissenters, radicals, and laymen. That is to say, those who openly oppose the war, those who cheer it on, and those who do their best not to pay attention, respectively. As Yudin argues, the laymen represent the majority of Russians, as many as 60 or 70% in his estimation, who have tried to maintain their private lives while avoiding the entire topic of Ukraine and the war. Quote, "It is obviously deplorable, but the upside of it is that these people are completely unwilling to participate in the war actively in any way," Yudin told me. Putin's strategy in the early months was to muddle through the war, offering the laymen life as usual in Russia's big cities, and the radicals a historic battle against Nazis and a Western machine hell-bent on destroying Russia. Both angles were available depending on where you chose to look. The dissenters, it should be said, got only ostracism and repression from the beginning. But then in September, Putin announced a military draft, or mobilization, for the first time intruding on the private space of the laymen, drafting many of them, or their husbands and sons, into the army and sending them to Ukraine. Mobilization put the illusions of the laymen under pressure, if it didn't blow them apart entirely. But, as Yudin argued, that will be a process that happens over time and is likely to take place on a personal rather than collective level. In other words, revolution is not nigh. Speaking broadly, the Russian public is habituated not so much to approve or disapprove of government policies, but rather to exist apart from them. The role of the individual is not to affect the state's behavior, but rather to protect him or herself against its consequences. This has become the defining method of protest in Russia. Yekaterina Shulman, a Russian political scientist, explained to me, who's now a fellow at the Bosch Academy in Berlin. Quote, "In America, people take to the streets with posters. In France, they like to go on strike. Whereas in Russia, the methods are those used by the weak and the dispossessed: evasion, sabotage, imitation, hypocrisy, and when necessary, escape." Yudin summed up this existential predicament, making clear to what extent many Russians have internalized their own political powerlessness. Quote, "If you notice that it's started to rain outside, it would be silly to sit around and to create a plan to how to stop the rain," he told me. "Better to figure out how not to get wet." Last month, I traveled again to Ukraine, my 5th trip since the start of the war. I wanted to check in with people I had met along the way, to get a sense of how the year of war has, for so many in Ukraine, imparted great trauma and loss, but also a sense of purpose and identity. I found a mounting sense of exhaustion, loss, and trauma. For many Ukrainians, the mere fact that the war is entering its 2nd year is unignorable proof that a quick victory isn't going to materialize. The fight shows little sign of ending soon, and if 2 years, then why not 3 or 4? For all its inefficiencies, Russia's military draft has had an effect on the battlefield. The kind of relatively easy and rapid counteroffensive that Ukraine mounted last September to take back territory in the Kharkiv region is unlikely to be repeated. Meanwhile, the Russian army is able to throw men and equipment at a renewed push in the Donbass. As of late January, the Kiev School of Economics put the total damage to Ukraine's infrastructure at nearly $130 billion. In many places in the country, the war is physically distant, felt less through military or artillery attacks than through cuts to electricity and heat. At any given moment, millions of households are without power, as the state energy provider has been forced to institute rolling blackouts in response to Russian strikes on power plants and substations. The guttural purr of diesel generators has become the background noise to life in just about every major Ukrainian city, as shops and restaurants struggle to keep the lights on. Early in the morning of October 17th, an Iranian-produced kamikaze drone, a weapon that Russia had been using to target energy infrastructure in Kiev, slammed into an apartment building on Zhulyanskaya Street. It was presumably meant to hit a neighboring thermal power plant, but overshot. Several floors of the building collapsed. Among those at home were Victoria and Bogdan Zamchenko, a couple in their mid-30s. Victoria was 6 months pregnant with their first child. They were killed in the blast, their bodies pulled out of the rubble by emergency workers. I instantly recognized Victoria's face when the news of her death began making the rounds. She worked as a sommelier at Good Wine, a gourmet emporium in the center of Kiev with an in-house bakery and coffee bar. Quote, "Today is a very dark day," Good Wine wrote in a post announcing her loss. "We loved Vika madly, and surely you did too." By then, I had met or interviewed a handful of soldiers who later died in battle, but this felt different. Victoria was an eminently familiar and recognizable peer, a young woman who worked in a wine shop and once helped me choose a suitable Pinot Noir. A friend in Kiev who had once attended a wine tasting led by Victoria remarked that her killing was a reminder that at this stage in the war, quote, "death was 1 or 2 handshakes away." I sat in Good Wine's cafe with Boris Tarasenko, a fellow sommelier. He told me how he accompanied Victoria's mother to the morgue. An official stepped out to tell her she could come identify her daughter's body. Quote, "You could see all her hopes collapse," Boris said. Victoria's mother lost the ability to walk or even stand upright and had to be carried back to the car. When I asked Boris how he feels now, he replied simply, "empty." He told me of a favorite saying of Victoria's, "Enough feeling sorry for yourself." Quote, "I have to repeat this phrase to myself a lot these days." Boris wanted to emphasize a final point. What happened to Vika is not a coincidence or a natural disaster, he told me. It's not like a tree fell on her apartment or the building collapsed in an accident. This was something different. It's murder, he went on. They killed this person. President Zelensky and Ukraine's military leaders are hesitant to make public the scale of losses on the battlefield, but the toll is surely enormous. Last November, Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chief of Staff, estimated that as many as 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers had been killed or wounded by that point in the war. Given that Ukraine's most promising, energetic, and patriotic young people were the first to volunteer to fight, their names have been overrepresented among the dead. Quote, "This war is consuming the best of our people," Natalia Gumenyuk, a Ukrainian journalist, remarked on the occasion of the death of Roman Ratushny, a prominent and beloved 24-year-old activist who was killed on the front in June. Around that time, a Ukrainian friend was trying to put me in touch with a soldier she knew named Vitaly Derech, who was the commander of an anti-tank unit then operating in the Donbass. Maybe I could pay Derech a visit near the front, she suggested. But then she wrote again to say that Derech was dead. He was 34, a former journalist, a well-known and widely liked local activist, scouting leader, and paramedic in his native Ternopil in western Ukraine. I spoke with 2 other members of Derech's unit who went by the call signs Poppy and Greek. They told me of a battle near the city of Popasna in which a Russian armored personnel carrier bore down on a group of Ukrainian soldiers, firing its large caliber cannon. Several were killed, even more were wounded, before Derech fired an anti-tank missile, blowing up the vehicle. A couple of days later, he spotted a column of Russian troop carriers on the move, preparing for a new attack. He fired on them, destroying them, slowing the assault. A few minutes later, a Russian fighter jet streaked across the sky and launched a missile that slammed directly into Derech's dugout. He was killed instantly. Several months went by. Ukraine lost more cities in the Donbass, even as it later went on to recapture others. In late September, I got another message. Greek was dead. He had been in a forward position near Bakhmut, a city in the Donbass that was weathering the bulk of the Russian onslaught. A day after Greek and 9 soldiers under his command arrived to replace another crew, a shell landed directly in their hideout. The explosion blew out the concrete blocks meant to secure the position, and they collapsed on top of Greek. It was impossible to retrieve his body. The debris weighed several tons, and the area was now under the control of Russian forces. I traveled to the Kharkiv region near the border with Russia to speak again with Poppy, the only remaining member of this original crew of 3. He is in his mid-30s and had fought in the First Donbass War in 2014. He later found work in construction and as a commercial sailor. Eventually, he took a job as a forklift operator at a factory in Estonia. The day Russia invaded, his passport was at the local immigration office, waiting for a work visa. He showed up and, to the confusion of the local clerks, demanded his passport back. By February 26th, he was in Ukraine, asking to be deployed. Early on, Poppy said his reconnaissance unit, along with Derek and Greek, was scouting the locations of Russian troops near the village of Matizhin, 25 miles from the capital. He had taken up a position on the edge of town, balancing a machine gun behind a tree, when a young girl from the village approached him. She offered him a plate of fresh blini. Quote, "I yelled at her, 'Get out of here. The Russians are 800 meters away,'" Poppy recalled. The girl said she would only leave if he took the pancakes. Quote, "How do you not want to fight for such people?" he told me. I understood then that I had not come in vain to defend my country. When I met him a few weeks ago, Poppy had become the commander of a platoon with nearly 100 soldiers. They had been rotated out of Bakhmut and sent near Kharkiv. The fight in Bakhmut had been tough, he told me. It felt as if Russian munitions were endless, a wall of fire that went on uninterrupted for days. The same could be said for Russian manpower. The assaults came in waves of 10 or 20 fighters. Quote, "We cut them down, but they don't care. They just keep coming." At the same time, he said, they are learning. The attacks are becoming more clever, more thought out. Smaller units had replaced larger columns. Ground forces were coordinating their movements with artillery and air power. I asked Poppy how this year of war had changed him. He has suffered 4 concussions, he said. There's Poppy. "I feel myself becoming more aggressive, unstable, harsh. There are times when everything upsets me." He has 3 children. 2 are in Kiev, a 3rd is in Poland. He'd like them to live in a peaceful, civilized, and democratic country. The cruel tragedy, he said, is that friends like Derek and Greek, 2 young men, vital and creative, in the prime of their lives, had to fight and die for what should be a given. Quote, "These guys were simply excellent, full of positivity," he told me. "They should have returned home and kept making life better for everyone around them." Poppy doesn't hide his own exhaustion from the soldiers under his command. Quote, "I tell them I also don't want to do this. I don't like this job. I don't need such a life. But I can't just walk away." If he did, he tells them, the front would move further and further until there was no country left to defend. The West has an important role to play in this story too, maybe a decisive one, in fact. Seeing as Ukraine's ability to fight the war depends in large part on weaponry provided by the West, the UK, the US, Germany, to name a few. In a way, this gives Western capitals a say in how long the war lasts and what sort of outcome awaits. This leads to some interesting and complicated questions. Is the West responsible to arm Ukraine for a protracted war with Russia? Should the aim be for Ukraine to defend itself or to defeat Russia once and for all? And what is the difference between those 2 outcomes? What does it mean to be interested in peace? Or rather, how can that peace be achieved? What if the pro-peace strategy is to support one side in the fight even with maximal weaponry, in the hope that the conflict ends sooner, with less bloodshed and victims. This is what many Ukrainians waiting on, say, German tanks argued over the fall and winter. Give us the tanks now, and we can push back Russian military from our territory right away. Wait any longer, and Russia will take even more of our land, costing lives on all sides, and only then, under the threat of further losses, will you finally decide to give us the tanks, but after thousands of lives have been lost needlessly. Earlier this fall, I interviewed Alexei Reznikov, Ukraine's Minister of Defense. We spoke about the Western arms that had already been delivered to Ukraine and those it was still waiting on. With the help of the US and NATO, he told me, Ukraine's military has shown that Russia can be confronted. Quote, "We are not afraid of Russia, and we are asking our partners in the West to also no longer be afraid." And that, I'm afraid, may be the key question for the war's second year. Thank you for your attention. Happy to take your questions.
Take your glass, and we'll take the chairs.
Great.
Yeah? Thank you. Okay, so once again, you can ask questions on Slido by going to slido.com and putting hashtag amerikahaus. To get us going, I have a question that was sent to me today from one of our members who's in Romania. And he said that Putin has now revoked the agreement of sovereignty of Moldova, and that they're getting a bit nervous, even in Romania. They read about plans to occupy Belarus, and starting yesterday, they have air raid warnings every Wednesday to get themselves ready just in case. And he says, how nervous should we in Eastern Europe be?
It's a big responsibility to weigh in on the correct ratio of a stranger's nervousness, and I would never want to deprive someone of the right and privilege to be nervous, or even the productive impulse that comes of nervousness. Maybe better, given the events of the past year, to err on the side of being overly nervous than overly sanguine. From a strictly military sense, not that I'm a particularly, I don't have a kind of fine-grained understanding of the military lay of the land and exactly how many tank divisions are where, but it certainly seems like Putin is has his hands full just trying to take more territory in the Donbass. I mean, as Ukrainians darkly joke, but correctly, I mean that Putin can't take the city of Bakhmut with a pre-war population of 70,000 for 6 months. The idea that Russian tanks are suddenly going to be in Berlin or Bucharest seems a bit unrealistic. So I'm not sure that Russia actually has the military wherewithal to expand its campaign, not just across Ukraine, but into other countries with the implications that would cause in terms
especially NATO countries.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, could there be attempts at subterfuge, at creating panic? Maybe planting the idea of such an incursion actually achieves more for Putin than actually having to try and carry one out. So I think that we may be living with the kind of phantom stress or idea of such incursions for some time, but I'm skeptical as to whether or not Russia actually has just the pure military power that it would need to carry them out.
Okay. The first question now from Slido is, according to German government data, 1.1 million Ukrainians have already fled to Germany. And he's wondering how we can best, or he or she is wondering how we can best help on the ground. I'm assuming that means on the ground in Ukraine.
I'm not sure. I can try and answer both ways. I mean, what I think is interesting and important and leads to some answers about how to help is the nature of this migration. And I mean, with 1.1 million people, hard to make generalizations about such a large population. But I think on the whole, the Ukrainians I know personally, I guess I'll speak on that basis, want to go back, want to go home. Yeah. This is not a one-way migration. I mean, of course, depending on how long the war goes on, lives develop, people put their kids in school, take jobs. I mean, it's quite possible that many end up staying, even if the initial idea was to go back. But I think on the whole, people fleeing Ukraine see that as a temporary measure. Also, for large part, men of military age, which is 18 to 60, I mean, it's a pretty large percent of the population, can't leave. So you're talking about separated families in most or many cases, which also creates both a stress and a burden, but also a reason to go back, right? The entire family isn't often able to set up, to put down roots in Germany or
Poland
or elsewhere,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that what Ukrainians would say, do say, and again, I'm going off of personal experience here, is that welcoming them with open arms in Germany is an extraordinary thing, and Ukrainians I know who are here, who have family members here, feel incredibly lucky and grateful for the degree of support that they've been given by the German state, but also even more so by the German public. I think that really has impressed Ukrainians who were met by volunteers at the train station, fed by volunteer families, or housed even by them in the weeks and months after their arrival. So that's all deeply appreciated. But since the goal is A, to win the war, and B, to be able to go home, and those are interlinked goals, what they really want is the ability to do so. And so thank you for the benefits that are accorded to us. I'm speaking here as a hypothetical Ukrainian in Germany, but what we really need is more German air defense for Kiev. What we really need are these Leopard tanks that the German government dragged their feet on for so many months and in larger quantities. So that's not to dismiss or negate or in any way be ungrateful for the help being given to Ukrainian refugees here, but Ukrainians would like to, as they see it, sort of solve the problem at its core, at its basis, right? Not deal with its after effects, but rather create a lasting solution, which, from the Ukrainian perspective, is only possible through victory on the battlefield.
Right. I have a question. As a segue, I'm going to ask you the opposite. I think it's Gary Kasparov who says, what are you waiting for? This is our war. The Europeans, there are European countries who are saying the military is, I think it's in Sweden, where they offered to give tanks, and then the military said, no, you can't give them all, we need some. And he's saying, what are you waiting for? This is the war. You need to give everything now. And then the flip side of that is that in Berlin, 10,000 people protested for peace and against the delivery of weapons to Ukraine just this weekend. What would your response be to those protesters?
My response, which is maybe unsatisfying to you and those in the audience, is that despite my answer a moment ago where I was really trying to get across the Ukrainian perspective voiced through myself, so maybe I gave them somewhat misleading idea that I was putting forth my own sort of strongly argued position in favor of tanks now and more of them. I understand that argument, but that's not my argument, and the reason my answer will be disappointing is that as a journalist I'm comfortable, but also it's not just an excuse. It's actually my true understanding and sort of mode of understanding the world, which is I'm a kind of reporter at heart and not a policymaker, and I understand the arguments on both sides, and I'm not at all cavalier or naive about the risks of the West providing arms either at the pace or scale that could change Putin's own calculation, that could lead to counterproductive escalations on the battlefield in Europe. Those are all real risks that I understand and am not Pollyannish about. At the same time, we have seen, if we just be reporters here, right, and analyze what has happened and not prognosticate about what may happen, it does seem like the West has managed rather successfully from the purpose of it, from its own perspective, to manage escalation regard to Putin, to provide an extraordinary amount of arms, the kind of arms that no Western capital would have thought possible in February, March of last year, things that were off the table suddenly became on the table. That's actually something else that Reznikov, Ukraine's defense minister, said to me back in the fall. He said, even then, back in the fall, when tanks were not on the agenda, and when Germany and other countries, the US, were against providing tanks, he said, trust me, they'll give us tanks. You know, they didn't want to give us this, then they gave it to us. They didn't want to give us this other thing. You know, we're going to get F-16s by the end of the year. And I think he's right. I mean, I'm not sure like literally about F-16s, but he's certainly right about the trajectory that time and time again, these particular weapon systems that the West said, we won't give to Ukraine. They're too escalatory. It's too dangerous to provide you with this. It could tip the balance of the war, could tip Putin's own calculations. Some months pass, and the West is providing it without real response from Putin. And that's why I think we can say, just being reporters or analysts here, looking backward and say that the West has managed to thread the needle, I think, successfully. And I don't know what the better kind of metaphor or cliche is about boiling the frog slowly maybe is the best image, but the West somehow got Putin used to the idea, step by step, of a large amount of Western arms flowing into Ukraine, that if there had been Abrams and Leopard tanks
right away,
that really might have produced an escalatory response. And I know that people in Washington, for example, are self-congratulatory about this. They feel like they got this question right. They think that they got the dosage and the pace correct, and that they've given Ukraine what it needs, not as much as the Ukrainians themselves would want, and not at certainly the pace that the Ukrainians would want, but they've managed to do it without creating this backlash. What that means going forward, to borrow a Russian expression, the appetite grows with the eating, that the more the US sees, A, that its weaponry is having an effect on the battlefield, and B, it's not provoking a response from Putin, it's hard to imagine a world in which then they don't continue to put more and more into the fight. We'll see what happens in coming months in the actual situation on the front, and what Russia is able to do with its offensive, what Ukraine is able to do with its counteroffensive. If it gets to a point in the war where there is a kind of de facto stalemate, where the lines are not moving much, and Western arms are not having the effect they once had, then you could potentially see interests and appetites changing. But for now, I think we're on a trajectory of more and more, just given enough time.
Okay. I want to flip to one of your articles this month about collaboration and cooperation, and that was also quite a topic in your book about how, and we've got someone here asking, saying Germany had 12 years of Nazi rule and took more than 40 years to denazify, and he's wondering about the normalization, the question, he or she, anonymous, is wondering about the question about Russia, but you also point out how difficult it is when there are areas where there were collaborators within Ukraine. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Indeed, thanks for mentioning this article from a few weeks ago, where I wrote about the deoccupation of a Ukrainian city in the Kharkiv region called Izum that was occupied for 6 months. And you might say only 6 months, right? Compared to cities in the Donbass that have been occupied for 8 years, Donetsk, Luhansk, others. Let alone, I'm not sure I'm ready to call it an occupation, but let alone 23 years and counting of Putin's Russia, which a whole generation or more, which will be even more difficult to undo the habits of thought and the kind of political and civic modes of thinking and operating that people have become habituated to. That's all going to be even more difficult to overcome. But even on the scale of a 6-month occupation, the question of the degree of collaboration, cooperation with the occupation authority, what is permissible, to what extent were people saving themselves in a desperate situation, to what extent were people taking advantage in a more cynical form to pursue power and privilege for themselves. The truth is that both of those things can be true at the same time. People can be understandably terrified because their city is under military occupation, and a very brutal military occupation. When the Russian army left Izum, a mass grave was discovered on the outskirts of town in a forest with 455 bodies. In a town of 50,000, that's a pretty serious toll. So the cost of confrontation, or the cost of resistance, was quite high, and I think it would be only fair to understand someone's existential terror at being trapped in such a situation. At the same time, in a period of scarcity, not enough food, not enough medicine, people trying to secure more for themselves. The World War II history here is really relevant. I cited it in that article of what people do to survive, and that becomes a really gray area. And we could talk about that in a different setting, not in the context of a war, in Russia itself, where the concept of what people feel they have to do or choose to do so as to survive, so as to make sense of their own lives, the society in which they live, requires great compromises. That's what I wrote about in my book. And that's, in a way, why I chose to write this article about collaboration in Izium, because I saw it as the next iteration, a much more intense, dark, brutal version of the same kinds of dynamics I had observed in my book, a really complicated and gray moral universe where it's hard to identify any person's actions as purely virtuous or purely evil. Most people existed on a spectrum in between that was forced upon them by the very difficult circumstances in which they found themselves.
Okay. Moving to Russia, we've got a question. As a journalist working out of Moscow, you witnessed media suppression and state control, which has gotten just more worse since you left. And given how the war's covered in Russia, how can Russian citizens, or how do you see the Russian population reacting to it? How can they overcome it, or how do you get the message to the Russians?
Well, I'm really taken by this taxonomy that I cited in my talk by the political philosopher and sociologist Greg Uden, returning to this idea of the laymen, laywomen, who do their best not to pay attention, who do their best to look away. And that, I would actually argue, is the basis for Russian support for the war. When we talk about Russian support for the war, we're not actually talking about a 1930s Germany situation when people are on their own volition coming to stadiums, marching, chanting, saluting, burning books. There's very little grassroots enthusiasm for that sort of thing in Russia. I would argue there's very little grassroots enthusiasm for the war in Russia. The tragic and terrible thing is that doesn't mean there is any real constituency to try and stop the war either. Yeah. And so returning to this idea of support for the war, support comes through non-participation, it comes through ignoring, it comes through separating oneself from the war. This concept I also talked about in reference to the political scientist Yekaterina Shulman. Protest that comes through distancing oneself from an unfortunate event, not trying to enact one's own will or position on an event, but simply trying to protect yourself from the consequences and keeping as much distance as possible. And I didn't mention some other interesting conversations I've had with those in Russia recently in the talk, but I spoke not long ago to Denis Volkov, who's the head of Levada Center, the preeminent and really only independent polling agency left in Russia, and he told me about some interesting focus groups that Levada Center had been carrying out.
Now?
Yes, since the war started. A few anecdotes I can pull from those. There was one at the very beginning of the war where he spoke to a woman who said essentially, I'm paraphrasing here a bit, or heavily, that she knows that if that there is other information, to your point about media, there's other information available out there. She referenced in her conversation with Volkov the BBC. She said, I know that there are other interpretations, there are other versions, there are other facts out there about what is happening in Ukraine, about the war. I know that if I watch BBC, I would get a different picture of things. And as a result of that picture, I would probably think differently about the war. And that's why I don't watch BBC, is what she told Volkov, which I thought was an extraordinarily
that's going on everywhere.
Forthright admission. I mean, she sort of said the quiet part aloud, as the saying goes, right? I mean, she really gave voice almost an admirable way, I would say, to her subconscious, or what for most people is a subconscious process, and she rendered it conscious. A more recent focus group that Volkov told me about, he described another conversation with, it was also a woman, who told him about the pain and trauma of the war, that it was an uncomfortable topic. The woman couldn't quite, yes, for her, couldn't quite bring herself to say she was against the war, but the whole question of the war made her deeply uncomfortable. And she said to Volkov, that's why I choose not to think about it. Otherwise, I'll make myself crazy. And at that point, I don't know how many people exactly were in the focus group, but lots of people apparently nodded along. There was a lot of consensus around this idea of if you think too much about this, you'll drive yourself crazy. And what's the point? Because we have no ability to affect this anyway. And the last anecdote I'll draw on from Volkov, this is more of a collective one rather than a specific conversation, but he told me about a real spike in anxiety and fear that was measured in polling the Levada Center did after mobilization was announced. Not after the war started, but only after mobilization was announced. There's a saying in Russia, I think, gets at the truth of that event, that only on September 21st, the day that Putin announced mobilization, did Russians understand what happened on February 23rd, right? This 6-month period in which they were able to ignore events in Ukraine, look away, became no longer possible when they themselves or their husbands and sons were being drafted. And the Levada Center measured the most dramatic spike in anxiety since the 1998 Russian default, since the economic crash of '98, in which people's savings were wiped out, the economy cratered, an understandably traumatic event for the country. People hadn't been that afraid and that panicked since then, until September and October of 2021. But by November, and certainly by December, people were back, at least according to the polls in the Levada Center, to feeling more or less how they had been. The status quo ante had returned. And the way Volkov described this, and this is in keeping with what I've quoted tonight from Yudin, Schulman, others, is that once the initial mobilization wave passed, even with 300,000 or more people drafted, quite a large number, still in a country of 144 million, most people were left unscathed, and they thought, whew, okay, I made it through. You know, my husband didn't get drafted, my son didn't get drafted, I'm okay. And they convinced themselves that, all right, the sort of plague passed my house.
Yeah.
I can exhale, and I'm now going to go on trying to figure out how to survive to the next crisis or to the next
mobilization.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea that there would be a kind of sustained collective response to mobilization is perhaps sadly naive, and that is highlighted in the Yudin quote I did mention tonight, right, about when it starts to rain outside. It would indeed, if that is how you relate to political and civic events, even war, it would indeed actually be crazy. You would be doing something crazy, just like it would be crazy for you and I to go outside and do a rain dance instead of just putting on a raincoat. Like, which of those responses seems more rational?
Right.
I think that's not a bad analogy, actually, for understanding the situation in Russia.
We have a question that dovetails on that. What do you think the biggest misperception or misconception in the West is about the war?
About how the war is treated in Russia, you mean? Or
in Ukraine. Although I think the question is, you could probably take it where do you want to go with that? Do you want to go with that? Do you see?
I'll try and do both. But it's hard for me to always, people ask about misconceptions. It's like I don't always know what the conception is. So to label it a misconception feels a bit
well, I guess when
imperious
you go
on my
there,
part. But
you've been there 5 times, right? So
right.
when you go there, is there something that strikes you that you didn't expect to see? Or when you come back, someone says something that doesn't?
Well, I'll try and answer the question by sharing an impression I got from Ukraine on the last trip, and then I'll try and do the same for Russia. I mentioned this in the talk, the degree that by this last time people were really exhausted. It really is remarkable and terrible that death has basically entered every home. It's not that someone has actually died in every single family, but
they know someone.
But know someone. I mean, it's ever present, and increasingly feels inescapable, like a kind of real life terrible Agatha Christie novel in which every turn of the page, someone is dying, and that has dampened the more raw spirit of the early months of the war, in which people felt, once Ukraine survived, to many people's own surprise, the first 3 days of the invasion, looked around, the country's still standing, Kiev hasn't been sacked. It led to a real boom in belief in themselves, in the country. And that still remains, but people are worn down by the toll of the war. That said, and I asked every person I talked to, okay, but so where does that take you? Where does that lead, just in your own mind, about what you think or want to happen? And I'm just telling you what people told me. This is no kind of false bravado on my part. Every single person I talked to said, but the only choice we have is victory. The only choice we have is to fight more and to defeat Russia. This only ends when we defeat Russia. If we come to some sort of deal with Russia, we'll lose part of our country. Ukrainians are convinced, I think, not without merit, that any kind of peace deal would in fact just give Putin a chance to
rearm.
Yeah, reconstitute his forces, rearm, learn the lessons of the first quasi-failed war and prepare for the second. Is that surprising or not, this idea that a year into the war there is such almost unanimous Ukrainian insistence on continuing the war and insisting on victory and not negotiations? I don't know if that's how surprising that is, or whether that somehow overturns a misconception that we have in the West, but I found that remarkable.
Yeah.
Because I kept looking for, okay, I get that you're exhausted, I get that you're worn down, I get that this is the toll of this, first and foremost, in people dying is becoming really unbearable. Where does that lead you? And I was taken at the answer I kept getting over and over again. As for the Russian side, the misconception, again, I don't know, but I would guess that some people would would assign different proportionality or percentages to those categories that Yudin outlined, the radicals, dissenters, and laymen. My guess is that in the West there's an idea that the quote-unquote radicals, the outwardly, proactively pro-war percentage of the population, is more of the population than it is. That in other words, the combination of propaganda and repression leads people to actually believe, and that maybe actually is the misconception. And this gets to one of the core ideas of the book. Propaganda and repression doesn't lead people to believe. It leads people to be very crafty, cynical, and self-aware about how they carry themselves in such a system. And they are very good at play-acting belief, at demonstrating loyalty and obedience when they need to
survive.
Being very savvy about the rules of the game, the unwritten rules of the game, not the rules that are written as laws, but the rules that actually govern and determine their safety. And that true believers are few and far between. And that maybe is the great tragedy of Russia, given how few true believers there are, yet the war continues.
Julia Yaffa wrote something for Puck today. I don't know if you saw it, along those lines. But she talked about the oligarchs seem to be sort of coming around. 72% of the bureaucrats support the war, but they're the ones who can, right? They're safe. Their rent is paid. They might not get to go skiing in Austria. They have to go skiing in Sochi. But she writes that the oligarchs seem to be the chief consumers of their own propaganda right now, that there seems to be a turn towards supporting Putin again.
I don't have immediate reporting on that, but I think it's, in a way, inevitable, especially the longer the war goes on. The most visible and powerful wealthy oligarchs are almost entirely under Western sanction in both the US and the EU. So if we just think about it from their perspective, okay, you don't like the war, but you've lost access to the US, the EU. Any idea that you might have any sort of business opportunities there is closed. The idea that you could even travel there physically is under great doubt. So what do you do with your internal discomfort about the war? There's also a kind of prisoner's dilemma problem to all of this, in that there's not really a lot of incentive to be the first oligarch to march into Putin's office and declare your opposition to the war. Of course, this is the whole problem of Russian politics and society writ large. If all the oligarchs, or if all 144 million people together oppose the war, you'd have a different situation. But since, for reasons we've now discussed in multiple different contexts already tonight, there's no habit or kind of muscle for collective action. People tend to operate individually, protect their individual interests. You're left with this kind of prisoner's dilemma problem of who wants to be the first oligarch to stick your head up. And having lost everything in the West, now lose everything in Russia, it's not rational. Why would we expect them to do that? And so, out of a kind of learned helplessness or lack of better options, you learn to make do with the situation you have. I'm not sure the extent to which they become, in their heart of hearts, pro-war, but they are energetic, talented, clever, ambitious people. And so, through a process of yet another cycle of reinvention, Russian oligarchs, almost by definition, are very talented chameleons who've been through this before in different contexts. The idea that they can create a new identity, narrative, business for themselves is not new. So it's a new challenge. I'm not sure that any other scenario is frankly that realistic.
This doesn't sound like it's going to end very soon. Okay, I'm not sure. Usually we try to end on an upbeat. I'm not.
Wait, it's the wrong talk for that.
I know.
Restaurants in Kiev are great. We can talk about that. Even in
we
wartime,
all
I
go on
ate
vacation.
really
I
well.
tell you, I can't wait.
Happy to give some restaurant recommendations.
Yeah, I cannot wait for the vacation we're all going to be doing in Odessa and Kiev. We have time for one more question, I think, looking at the clock. Let me try to pool a few together. We haven't talked about China. Rather than ask, there are a few questions about China here. Do you have any, there are all kinds of things. There's this Chinese peace plan. What if China gives, how close do you have reporting how close they are to giving weapons? What do you think would change? How would the dynamic change? Take whatever you want with China. We'll
Okay, I don't want to end
put it together into one question.
I don't want to end on a disappointing note to myself, first and foremost. Maybe I have another non-China related question, because China is really outside of my area of expertise of reporting. But I will say that, in a way, despite China's apparent discomfort with the war, the idea that she, at various points, has told Putin to end it quicker, that this is too disruptive, it is quite, in a way, advantageous for China in that someone else gets to disrupt the Western-led security order and pay the price for it. At the same time, Russia becomes a desperate supplier of energy, cut off largely from European markets, needs to find an outlet for all that gas. Well, there's a huge border with China. China could use the gas, but I'm not don't have a PhD in economics, but when you reduce the number of buyers to one,
even I can do that.
Right, the buyer gets to dictate a pretty advantageous price. So I think that in a way, all of this looks not so bad actually to China. And if they do provide arms, that I think will be a qualitatively different phase of the war, because my reporting and experience in Ukraine, especially this last trip, suggests that Russia is actually, if not quite running low enough that it has to ration its use of especially things like long-range cruise missiles. When I was in Kiev, people told me I'd come at a good time, in a way.
Because there was a shortage?
Yes, because the Russian missile attacks were now happening at intervals of once every 2 or 3 weeks, which was much slower, much more spaced out than it had been in the fall, and that Russia was being much more selective with what it struck, and first and foremost was striking less. And I've heard
less is good.
I heard same thing from people on the front, where it's not a question of things like long-range cruise missiles, but more like artillery shells, that things were not quiet, but quieter there as well. And if China were to enter with its production and supply capabilities, that could change that story yet again.
Yeah.
Yet again, yeah.
Okay. Great. God, I would love to just keep going. We're running out of time. This is pretty open-ended. With all of you talk about winning the war. What is the best case scenario outcome that you see as a last question?
I don't see this ending anytime soon. So there is the promised pessimism, unfortunately. I just don't see either side, Russia or Ukraine, believing that not fighting is more advantageous than fighting anytime soon. I think both sides still believe there is more to be gained by continuing offensives or counteroffensives than by pausing things and going to negotiations. From the Russian side, it's unclear what this whole war is about. And in fact, if you listen to Putin, he is...
the goalposts keep moving.
Yes, and he's actually talking less about Ukraine. He's now kind of preparing Russia for this indeterminate forever war with the West, where the goals are really fuzzy. It's no longer about political situation in Ukraine, borders, the Donbass, the annexed territories. It's about this, it's a more existential battle that is impossible to define, or Putin doesn't really bother to define what even is Russia fighting for at this point. It sounds like instead Russia war has become actually the new raison d'etre of Putin's rule. The system is now about war. The purpose of Putin's rule, continued rule, is war. There's no other narrative or explanation possible. And there's a real, I think, political danger at this point that once the war stops, so does the obvious logic or need for Putin's rule, because he has so attached himself and the system now to this idea of war and conflict, like I said, not just with Ukraine, but with the West writ large. From the Ukrainian side, I've mentioned this before, the degree to which there is such overwhelming popular, not just support, but demand for continuing to fight back, to take back Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is a democracy. It would be politically impossible at this point for Zelensky to negotiate away Ukrainian territory over the heads of the Ukrainian public. We may get to a point after the next attempted Ukrainian counteroffensive or two, if those stall, if the lines de facto freeze, perhaps mood in Ukraine could shift toward accepting the status quo territorial borders, but they're certainly not there yet. And what I find hard to imagine is that we'll get there anytime soon in terms of an actual settlement in which either side is willing to put on paper what they've lost or what they've gained, and maybe, and this is, I'm just borrowing from analysts smarter than myself, a kind of Korea situation is more realistic. An armistice that functionally freezes the conflict but never actually solves it. How many decades later,
Right.
The two Koreas, I mean, I could get the specifics wrong here, but I think are technically still at war. Certainly that conflict has not actually been solved on paper, even if it's been effectively frozen for decades now. And I think that something like that is the more realistic, not even near term. Near term, I think the war is going to continue, maybe medium term solution.
All right, we could go on. I could dive into so many more questions. For those of you here, you're in luck because we have books that Josh is happy to sign, and we've got a wine bar out there so we can keep talking. For those of you at home, I'm so sorry. Come next time. But thank you for joining us. And I would also like to mention that on Slido, there is a, did I say that already? Did I mention the Slido questionnaire? It's the Auswärtigen Amt, and if you have time and you are so inclined, please go to Slido and fill out the form if you were happy or not with how Slido worked for you tonight. And I'd like to invite everybody to join, if you have not yet, to join our website, dialoguesondemocracy.com. That just gets you the emails about what our next events are. Before we go, I want to thank a few people. I want to thank the hospitality of Amerikahaus, Dominique Rabe, the program director, and of course, as always, a big hand for the tech team in the back, because they make it look so easy to have live and online just magically happen, and they're very good at it. So thank you guys in the back. I'd like to thank the Melior Foundation for their generosity and support and interest in promoting transatlantic and pro-democracy initiatives. And we are an all-volunteer operation running on generous support from our partners at Amerikahaus and from you guys, our members. So to everyone who has donated, thank you. It makes this possible. And if you like what we're doing and the spirit moves you, I hope you'll think about putting us in your philanthropy mix. Our next event will be in April with Matt Armstrong on the politics of US information warfare. You can follow our website and Amerikahaus website for that. Follow Amerikahaus anyway, because they have all kinds of really cool stuff going on. And in closing, I'd like to refer to the dedication of Timothy Snyder's book, The Road to Unfreedom. For the reporters, the heroes of our time. Joshua Yaffa, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was great.